My fiance's bachelor party group chat accidentally included me. I read messages planning how to enjoy one last night of freedom with female strippers and his ex. I never replied. I just sent the screenshots to his father, the man who was paying for the entire wedding. Hello, everyone. My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 32 years old, and until about a week ago, I believed I was about to marry a man I truly understood. Not perfectly, not blindly, but enough to trust him with the rest of my life. His name was Ethan. We had been together for 3 years, engaged for almost one, and from the outside, we looked like one of those couples people quietly envied. Everything around us seemed steady, organized, almost too polished to fail. The venue had already been booked. The invitations had been sent. Our families were involved. Deposits had been paid. His father was covering most of the wedding, and because of that, everything felt even more official, more locked in, like the future had already been signed and stamped before either of us reached the altar. From the outside, there was no visible room left for doubt, and maybe that was the problem. Ethan was the kind of man who cared about appearances in a way that seemed harmless at first. He was charming without trying too hard, social in that easy way people admired, always composed when others were watching. We were not the dramatic couple. We didn't fight in restaurants. We didn't post vague captions. We didn't drag our private issues into public rooms. Most people saw us as stable, mature, done deals. I let that image comfort me more than I should have. Because when nothing looks broken, you start excusing the little cracks. You tell yourself his silence after certain questions means he's tired, not evasive. You tell yourself the way he brushed off old stories about his ex meant they were irrelevant, not unfinished. You tell yourself that a man who stands beside you during venue tours, cake tastings, family dinners, and seating chart arguments must be a man who has already chosen you completely. Looking back now, I think that was my biggest mistake. I kept waiting for anything suspicious to feel big enough before I allowed myself to call it what it was. The week everything fell apart started like any other week in final wedding planning. We were buried in last-minute confirmations, payment timelines, guest adjustments, tiny details that somehow carried the weight of national security. I was checking floral updates and transportation schedules. Ethan was handling a few remaining calls with vendors and pretending to care more about napkin colors than he actually did. His bachelor party was scheduled for that weekend. Nothing about that on its own bothered me. I'm not one of those women who thinks a pre-wedding party automatically means betrayal. People celebrate. People act silly. Friends push boundaries. As long as respect stays intact, I don't see the point in policing someone else's last night before marriage. That is what I believed then. That evening, I was home alone, half reading a vendor email and half thinking about whether my mother would complain about the rehearsal dinner menu. My phone lit up with a notification from a group chat. At first, I barely looked at the name. It was one of those chaotic event threads full of emojis, nicknames, and too many inside jokes. I assumed it had something to do with a cousin, or a distant family coordination mess, or maybe a wrong number. I opened it casually, and within seconds I understood something was wrong. I wasn't supposed to be in there. The chat was already active. Messages were coming fast, overlapping, careless in the way people only get when they are certain no dangerous eyes are watching. At first, nothing seemed catastrophic. It looked like planning. Pickup times, reservation details, a few jokes, the usual noise of a group trying to turn one night into a memory people would talk about for years. Then the tone started to shift. Not all at once. That was the disturbing part. It happened gradually enough that if I had skimmed, I might have missed it. One message said, "Okay, but we're actually doing this properly, right? No boring night." Another replied, "Relax, I already booked the dancers." A third came in almost immediately after that. "Not just dancers, don't ruin the surprise." I remember staring at my screen a little longer. Then, not because I was panicking, but because my mind had started noticing what my body already knew. Something inside me had gone still. I scrolled higher, then lower, then back again. The details became clearer the more I read. This wasn't vague party energy. It wasn't friends being stupid in a private thread. It was coordinated, structured, planned with intention. Times, arrivals, reactions they expected, things they knew should stay hidden. Then one message appeared that changed the temperature in my chest completely. "Are we still bringing her?" At first, it meant nothing, just a sentence in a flood of noise. Then the replies came. "Yes, obviously. He literally asked for it." Another one. Make sure she gets there before the dancers. He's going to lose it when he sees her. I stopped scrolling. Not because I didn't want to know more, because I already understood enough to know exactly what her meant before I even saw the next message. Still, I forced myself to keep reading. I needed facts before emotion. A few lines later, there it was. Her name, his ex-girlfriend. Not brought up as a joke, not mentioned in passing. Not some random drunken suggestion people would forget by morning. Included. Expected. Positioned like part of the event itself. Someone wrote, "This is going to be insane." Someone else replied, "Last night of freedom. Let him have fun." That sentence sat on my screen longer than the others. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. That was the real thing underneath all the jokes, the emojis, the fake chaos. Not harmless fun, not clueless friends. A belief that commitment could pause when no one was looking. That marriage still had room for one final betrayal as long as it happened before the vows. And maybe the worst part wasn't even them. Maybe the worst part was how comfortable everyone sounded. No fear, no hesitation, no one saying this was a bad idea, no one wondering whether I might be hurt, no one speaking like there was anything sacred left to protect. At one point, someone asked, "What if Naomi finds out?" The reply came back so fast it almost felt rehearsed. She won't. I don't think I breathed for a second after reading that. Because those two words told me everything the rest of the messages were still trying to decorate. They didn't think there was any risk, because they didn't respect me enough to imagine I might ever see the truth. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. For a moment, I just sat there. No crying, no screaming, no dramatic collapse onto the floor. Just stillness. There are moments in life when pain arrives loudly, and there are moments when it arrives like cold glass sliding into place. That was one of those moments. Not explosive, precise, the kind that changes the shape of reality before your face has even caught up. When I picked my phone back up, I wasn't reading as a fiancé anymore. I was reading as a witness. I went back through everything slowly, every message, every confirmation, every detail that proved intent. I took screenshots carefully, systematically, making sure the thread told the story clearly without needing commentary from me. The dancers, the timing, the the expectation, the confidence that I would never know. I didn't type into the chat. I didn't leave it. I didn't react with a single visible emotion. Silence was stronger, because once people know they've been seen, they start rewriting themselves. And I wanted them exactly as they were when they thought they were safe. When I finished, I leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds. Then I asked myself the only question that mattered. Who, besides me, deserved to know before this went any further? Not his friends. They were already in it. Not Ethan, he already knew. Not my family, not yet. I wasn't ready to turn this into a storm before I understood where to strike. Then one name came to me with absolute clarity. Richard Hayes. His father. The man paying for the venue, the catering, the flowers, the music, the luxury hotel block, almost everything that made this wedding feel larger than life. The man shaking hands at family dinners, talking about futures and stability and how proud he was that his son was building something real. He was the one person still standing outside the lie. And I suddenly couldn't bear the thought of him funding a performance. I opened my contacts and found his name. My thumb hovered over it for a second. Not because I was unsure, because I understood exactly what sending those screenshots would do. This wasn't the kind of message you could take back. It wasn't a warning shot. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. Once I sent it, the future we had spent months building would no longer belong to Ethan and me. It would start collapsing in places we couldn't control. I looked at the screenshots one more time. Then I sent them. No explanation. No emotional paragraph. No, I'm sorry. Just the truth. And after that, I set my phone down and let the silence come back. Because whatever happened next had already started. I didn't check my phone right away after sending the screenshots. That wasn't hesitation, it was discipline. Once you send something that irreversible, staring at your screen too soon turns clarity into panic, and I refused to let panic take over the one thing I still had control of, which was myself. I already knew what I had sent. More importantly, I knew what it meant. So I left my phone on the table, muted the room, and let time move without me chasing it. For about 20 minutes, nothing happened. Or maybe things were happening very quickly somewhere else, and I just wasn't watching them unfold. Then my phone buzzed once. Just once. Not a stream of messages, not frantic calls, just a single vibration cutting through the quiet. I picked it up and looked at the screen. Richard Hayes. The message was short. Call me. That was all. No question marks, no confusion, no accusation, Just 2 words from a man who didn't waste language when he had already reached a conclusion. I called him immediately. He answered before the second ring. For the first few seconds, neither of us spoke, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that only exists when two people are standing on opposite sides of the same truth, both aware that once it is spoken aloud, nothing will return to where it was before. Then he asked very calmly, "Is this real?" I didn't over-explain. I didn't try to cushion it. "Yes." He went quiet again. I could hear his breathing, controlled and even, which somehow unsettled me more than shouting would have. If he had raised his voice, it would have sounded like emotion. This sounded like judgment, like a door closing somewhere deep inside him. Then he asked, "Where is he?" I gave him the location of the party. Another beat of silence. I was suddenly aware of how cold my kitchen had become, how the overhead light made everything look flatter than it had an hour earlier, how the life I had been organizing down to seating cards and centerpiece approvals had started to feel like it belonged to someone else. He didn't comment on the screenshots. He didn't ask whether Ethan had actually responded. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't try to defend his son, and he didn't offer the kind of stunned fatherly denial most people would expect. He just said, "Stay where you are." Then he hung up. I stared at the phone for a long moment after the call ended. That calmness stayed with me. It would have been easier, in a strange way, if he had exploded. Anger is loud. Loud things scatter. Loud things can still be negotiated with. But his voice had the weight of something already decided. It carried no hope of delay, no room for interpretation. I didn't text Ethan. I didn't call anyone. I didn't try to warn the people in that group chat that the lie they were celebrating was about to collide with reality. A part of me could have. A weaker part, maybe. The part that still wanted to soften things. The part that had spent years making excuses for discomfort before it became undeniable. The part that still remembered Ethan laughing in our kitchen, helping me choose wall colors, kissing my forehead in passing like tenderness was the most natural thing in the world. But I knew better now. Truth doesn't become cruelty just because it arrives at the worst possible moment. So I stayed where I was. I made tea I never drank. I sat by the window. I watched headlights move across the street outside. People living ordinary evenings, not knowing mine had split in two. About an hour later, my phone started buzzing again. This time it didn't stop. Messages, calls, more messages. Ethan, then Ethan again. Then unknown numbers. The names I recognized from the group chat. I didn't need to open anything to understand what had happened. The rhythm of the notifications said enough. Whatever scene had played out at that party, it hadn't stayed private for long. The confidence that had lived in those messages was gone now. I could feel it in the speed, in the repetition, in the digital panic pressing against my screen. Eventually, I opened the chat list, but not the messages themselves. Just the previews were enough. "Naomi, what the hell did you do? Pick up. Right now. This is insane. You took this way too far." One message from an unknown number read, "Do you realize what you've caused?" I looked at that one a little longer than the others. Because that question always comes when people lose control of a lie. Not why did this happen? Not how did we get here? But how dare you expose the consequences of what we chose? I still didn't respond. The group chat itself was active too, but now the tone had changed completely. Gone were the smug jokes, the playful confidence, the little performance of people treating betrayal like entertainment. In its place came confusion, blame, fragments of fear. Who told him? "Oh my God, he's here. This is bad. Stop texting in here. Is Ethan okay?" I didn't scroll further. I didn't need the details yet. I could picture enough on my own. Richard walking into that room, the music dropping under the weight of recognition, faces changing, smiles dying mid-expression. Ethan realizing, maybe a second too late, that the life he had been coasting toward on borrowed certainty had just slammed into the one person whose approval and money had made it possible. There is something brutal about consequences arriving in front of witnesses, not because the witnesses matter more than the act, but because humiliation strips away people's ability to keep lying to themselves. Nearly 40 minutes after the first wave of calls, my phone rang again. "Richard." I answered immediately. This time there was no silence at all. "It's done," he said. His voice was still calm, but heavier now, not shaken, settled. I stood up without meaning to. "What do you mean?" "The venue is canceled," he said. "The payments are stopped. There is no wedding." For a moment, I said nothing. I had known, logically, that sending him those screenshots could lead here. I had understood it in theory. But hearing the words spoken out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It wasn't even just a breakup, not yet. It was infrastructure collapsing, contracts, deposits, plans, expectations, conversations scheduled weeks ahead. Every polished little piece of a future we had been assembling was being dismantled in real time by a man who had decided he would not finance a lie. Richard exhaled slowly. Then he said something that hit me harder than I expected. "Thank you for telling me the truth." I closed my eyes for a second. Not because I was relieved, not exactly. Because those words carried a kind of dignity I hadn't expected to find anywhere near this mess. He was thanking me, not for humiliating his son, not for ruining a wedding, but for refusing to let him continue investing in something false. There was pain in that for both of us, but no confusion. "I'm sorry," I said quietly, and for the first time that night, I meant it in more than one direction. He understood that too. "I know," he replied. Then the call ended. I lowered the phone and stood very still in the middle of my apartment. No wedding. The sentence echoed strangely in my head. 3 words: clean, absolute. And yet they seemed to tear through hundreds of smaller things all at once. The dress hanging in the spare room, the seating chart draft folded on the counter, the unopened boxes of favors, the RSVP list with names that no longer had anywhere to go, the honeymoon itinerary saved in my email, the version of myself who had been moving confidently toward a life that now, suddenly, had no doorway left. I thought I would cry then. I didn't. What I felt was stranger. Not numbness, not rage, not even grief in its full form yet. It felt like standing in the wreckage of a building you had lived inside for years, and realizing the collapse hadn't started tonight. Tonight was just when the walls finally became honest enough to fall where you could see them. My phone lit up again. Ethan, calling. Again. Then a voice note came through. Then another. I ignored all of it, because I already knew what kind of version of the story was coming next. Not the version where he had betrayed me. The version where I had gone too far. The version where exposure would be treated as violence and deception would be treated as a mistake that deserved privacy. The version where the problem would somehow become my timing, my method, my refusal to protect him from the outcome of his own choices. I wasn't ready to hear any of that. Not when the truth was still clean. Not when I could still hold the shape of it in my hands without letting him smear it into something softer, smaller, easier to survive. So I turned my phone face down again. Outside, the night kept moving. A motorcycle passed. Somewhere downstairs, a door opened and shut. Someone laughed in the hallway. Ordinary life continued with that almost insulting steadiness the world keeps whenever your personal disaster fails to qualify as a public event. But inside my apartment, everything had changed. Not gradually, completely. And somewhere beneath the shock, beneath the ache that hadn't fully arrived yet, another feeling was beginning to form. Clarity. Not comfort. Not peace. Just clarity. The kind that comes when something hidden is dragged into light and, instead of becoming complicated, becomes simple. He had known what he was doing. His friends had known. His ex had been invited into the center of it on purpose. And every part of that plan had depended on one assumption: that I would remain outside it, that I would stay trusting, quiet, uninformed, manageable. They were wrong. The next morning, when I finally opened my phone properly, his name covered the screen. Calls, messages, voice notes, repeated attempts to force a conversation on his terms now that the silence was no longer working in his favor. I opened the first text. "What did you do?" The second came right after it. "Why would you send that to my father?" And then another. "You ruined everything." I stared at those words for a long time. Not because they hurt, because they revealed him. Not "I'm sorry." Not "I messed up." Not "Can we talk?" Just accusation, possession, loss. Everything centered on consequence. And in that moment, before I had replied to a single thing, before I had even decided whether to see him at all, I understood something that chilled me even more than the group chat had. He still didn't think the betrayal was the real story. He thought the collapse was. A few hours later, someone knocked on my door. And when I looked through the peephole, Ethan was standing there. When I opened the door, Ethan didn't look like the man I had agreed to marry. He looked like someone who had been pushed out of a version of reality he thought would keep protecting him. His hair was slightly out of place, not enough to seem wild, just enough to show he had been running his hands through it too many times. His jaw was tense, his shirt was wrinkled. His expression carried that unstable mix of anger and disbelief people wear when the consequences have arrived faster than their excuses. For a second, neither of us spoke. I just stood there with one hand still on the door, taking him in. He looked at me like he didn't know whether to start by blaming me, convincing me, or pretending he had come to explain something that could still be explained. In the end, he chose anger first. "What did you do?" he asked. "Not hello. Not can we talk. Not I'm sorry. Just that." I held his gaze for a moment before answering. I showed the truth to someone who deserved to see it. His expression hardened immediately. "That wasn't your place." The speed of that answer almost would have impressed me if it hadn't said so much. I let the silence sit between us for a beat, then said very calmly, "Neither was what you planned." That stopped him. Not fully. Not enough to make him honest, but enough to interrupt the script he had walked up here expecting to use. His shoulders shifted, his jaw tightened again. "You had no right to send private messages to my father." Private. There it was. The word people reach for when they want secrecy to sound dignified. I shook my head once. "It wasn't private, Ethan. It was hidden. That's not the same thing." He gave a short, humorless laugh and looked away for a second, like he couldn't believe I was going to hold that line. Then he looked back at me, sharper now. "It was a bachelor party," he said. "It got out of hand. That's all." "No," I said, that's not all." He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the energy of someone trying to regain ground by reducing the physical distance. "You're making it bigger than it was." I didn't move. Because that was the entire strategy now, wasn't it? Make it smaller. Make it blurrier. Make it sound like a misunderstanding inflated by emotion. Turn planning into chaos. Turn intent into stupidity. Turn betrayal into bad optics. I had seen the messages. There was no blur left. "You had female strippers arranged," I said evenly. "Your ex was invited on purpose. Your friends were coordinating the timing. And everybody in that chat was comfortable because they were sure I wouldn't find out." His mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since he got there, I saw uncertainty flicker across his face. "It didn't happen," he said. I looked at him steadily. "That's your defense?" He frowned. "I'm saying you blew up our entire wedding over something that didn't even happen." I almost smiled then, not because anything was funny, but because that sentence was so revealing it felt surgical. He still didn't understand what the crime was. In his mind, the line had not been crossed because the night had been interrupted before completion, as if intention meant nothing, as if arranging betrayal only became betrayal after the final physical act. "You asked for her to be there," I said. His expression shifted again, a flash of panic this time. "No, I didn't." I cut him off before he could build a lie around grammar. "Your friend said you did." "That doesn't mean—" "Then what does it mean?" He went quiet. Not for long, but long enough. That was the thing about Ethan. He had always been persuasive when the room still wanted to believe him. But when you remove goodwill, when you take away the assumption that he must mean well, his charm loses structure very quickly. It starts to sound like editing instead of honesty. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "You should have come to me." I felt something cold settle even deeper inside me. "I did come to you," I said. He blinked. "What?" "I came to you every time something felt off and you brushed it aside. Every time I asked a question and you made me feel dramatic for even asking it. Every time I gave you the chance to be clear." "That's not fair." "No," I said quietly. "What wasn't fair was planning one last night of freedom, like I was some obstacle you just had to get past before the wedding." His face changed at that. Something in that sentence landed. For a second, he stopped looking angry and started looking exposed. "It wasn't like that," he said, but his voice had lost some force. "Then tell me what it was like." He stared at me. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from defensive to strained. "It was stupid," he said. "Okay. It was stupid. The guys pushed things too far. They thought it would be funny. They made it bigger than it needed to be." I listened without interrupting. Not because I believed him, because sometimes the quickest way to expose someone is to let them continue. "And my ex being there," he added, rubbing the back of his neck now, trying to look exhausted instead of guilty. "I didn't know they were serious about that." I held his gaze. "But you didn't stop it." He hesitated. That hesitation told the truth before he ever tried to answer. "I didn't think it mattered," he said finally. I let that sit in the air between us. Didn't think it mattered. Not my trust. Not my dignity. Not the fact that he was days away from marriage and still entertained the idea of his ex walking into the center of his bachelor party like some final temptation dressed up as a joke. "You didn't think it mattered," I repeated. He heard it the way I meant it then, because some of the fight in his face gave way to something more fragile. "Naomi." "No." My voice was still calm, but firmer now. "Don't say my name like that now." He stopped. A few seconds passed. The hallway behind him was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a door shut. Life kept making small, ordinary sounds around us, which only made the conversation feel more surreal. Ethan looked down for a moment, then back up. You destroyed everything. There it was again. Not I hurt you. Not I betrayed you. Not I made a choice that blew up our future. Just loss. His ruined plans. His wreckage. I nodded once. No, I stopped something that wasn't real. His eyes narrowed. That's dramatic. No, I said. What's dramatic is building a wedding on top of a lie and acting shocked when it collapses. That hit harder than the others had. I saw it in the way his mouth tightened, in the way his posture shifted, in the way he suddenly looked less like a man making an argument and more like someone trying to stand upright in a room that kept tilting beneath him. He glanced away from me, toward the stairwell, then back again. My father had no right to cancel everything without even hearing me out. I almost laughed then, but what came out instead was something quieter and crueler. He heard enough. That's not the point. It is exactly the point. He ran a hand over his face. You knew what would happen if you sent those screenshots. Yes, I said. He stared at me. Maybe he had expected guilt, or softening, or at least some tremor in my voice that would let him believe I was still reachable through emotion. There was none. For the first time since he arrived, the balance shifted visibly. He had come here assuming I would be heartbroken enough to still negotiate. Instead, he found someone who had already crossed the private line between pain and clarity. That was cruel, he said. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. What was cruel, I said, was trusting me enough to let me plan our wedding, while you let your friends build a night around strippers and your ex. He swallowed. I saw that. A tiny movement, but real. He was finally starting to understand that I was not going to help him carry this in a prettier way. It didn't mean anything, he said, and now his voice was quieter, more tired, less certain. It was just one night. I looked straight at him, and that one night told me everything I needed to know. His eyes searched my face, probably looking for the woman who would have argued longer, cried harder, softened eventually. The woman who might still have asked whether therapy, apologies, distance, or time could save something. She wasn't standing here anymore. You could have talked to me first, he said. There was almost something pleading in it now, but even that plea was still shaped around control. He didn't mean talk to me so I could tell the truth. He meant talk to me so I could manage the damage before it reached anyone else. I answered him the way the truth deserved. You just didn't think I was paying attention. That landed harder than anything else I had said, because it was not about the party anymore. It was about the whole relationship. Every moment he assumed I would ignore what was inconvenient. Every time he relied on my patience more than his honesty. Every quiet calculation that let him believe I would stay loving, reasonable, and easy to maneuver no matter what he withheld. He looked at me for a long time after that. Then the anger started draining out of him, leaving something less polished behind. Not remorse, not fully, more like the first ugly shape of recognition. The realization that he had not just lost a wedding. He had lost the version of me that made his life easier by believing him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower. You didn't have to do it like this. I held his gaze and answered with the clearest thing I knew. It was the only way it would be real. His face shifted once more after that, but this time there was no quick response. No clean comeback, no new angle. Because the argument had ended. Not loudly. Completely. He knew it. I knew it. He looked past me into my apartment for one brief second, as if he could still see traces of the life we had been building in there. Then he looked back at me. For 1 second, I thought he might finally apologize. Not for the money. Not for the fallout. Not because his father had cut him off. For me. For what he had turned me into on the edge of our wedding. But the apology never came. Instead, he just gave a small, bitter nod, stepped back, and said, I hope you're happy. It was such a disappointing line that it almost gave me peace. Because only someone still avoiding the truth would say something like that. As if this had been revenge instead of revelation. As if I had won something glamorous instead of lost something rotten. I didn't answer. I didn't owe him one more clean sentence to misuse later. So I stood there in silence and let that be the end of it. After a moment, he turned and walked down the hallway without looking back. I closed the door slowly. Then I locked it. And for the first time since this started, I let myself lean against the wood and breathe. Not because I was breaking. Because I wasn't. That was the strange part. I had expected devastation, collapse, some cinematic unraveling where grief would hit all at once and take my legs out from under me. Instead, what I felt was sharper and quieter, a kind of brutal steadiness. He had come here to make me doubt what I knew. He failed. He had come here hoping the weight of the ruined wedding would scare me into rethinking what I'd done. It didn't. And somewhere in the silence that followed, I realized something even worse for him than the canceled venue, the stopped payments, or the humiliation of that night. The wedding was not the only thing that had died. The illusion had too. The The silence after Ethan left didn't feel empty. It felt stripped, like someone had walked through my life and removed everything decorative, everything staged, everything that only looked solid because I hadn't tested it too closely. What was left wasn't comforting, but it was real. For the first time in months, there was nothing left to plan. No seating charts waiting for revisions. No vendors expecting confirmation emails. No timelines broken down into 15-minute increments. No future that required me to keep pretending everything made sense. Just space. I stayed by the door a little longer than necessary, listening to the quiet settle back into the apartment. But something had changed. Not just between Ethan and me. Inside me. Because now, everything I had ignored before was starting to rearrange itself into something unmistakable. It didn't start at that party. That was just where it became undeniable. I walked into the living room and sat down, letting my eyes fall on the small pieces of a life that no longer existed the way I had imagined it. The wedding binder was still open on the table. Notes in my handwriting filled the margins. Tiny check marks next to tasks I had completed. Questions circled for things I still needed to finalize. I reached over and closed it. Not dramatically, just closed. Because there was no version of this that needed finishing anymore. My phone buzzed again, but less urgently this time. The storm had passed its peak. What was left now wasn't panic, it was aftermath. I picked it up, and, for the first time since everything started, I actually opened a few more messages. Not from Ethan, from others. One of his friends had written, "This got way out of hand. No one meant for it to blow up like this." Another message, "You didn't have to go nuclear." I stared at that phrase for a second, as if truth was an overreaction, as if silence would have been the reasonable choice, as if protecting their comfort mattered more than protecting my reality. I didn't respond. Another message came in from someone else. "He didn't even do anything. You ended everything over something that didn't happen." I read that one twice. Then I put my phone down, because that argument again revealed everything I needed to understand about the people surrounding Ethan. To them, the problem wasn't the intention. It wasn't the planning. It was exposure. They didn't want accountability. They wanted plausible deniability. And once that was gone, they didn't know how to stand in the truth without feeling like victims themselves. I leaned back against the couch and let my head rest for a moment. That's when the memories started shifting. Not new ones, old ones. Small, forgettable moments that I had dismissed at the time because they didn't feel serious enough to confront. The way Ethan used to go quiet whenever his ex came up in conversation. The way he would say things like, "It's complicated," and then redirect before I could ask anything more specific. The way he cared just a little too much about how others perceived him. How he positioned our relationship in front of people. How everything needed to look smooth, controlled, impressive. The way he avoided direct answers when something didn't fit neatly into the image he wanted to maintain. Back then, I had translated those moments into something softer. I told myself he just didn't like conflict, that he was trying to move forward, that he didn't want to revisit the past unnecessarily. But now, those same moments felt different. They felt like omissions, like careful editing, like someone shaping a narrative instead of living honestly inside it. Because the truth wasn't just that Ethan had planned a reckless, disrespectful night before our wedding. The truth was that he had always needed a version of reality that looked better than it actually was. And I had helped him maintain it. That realization hurt more than anything he had done, because it meant I wasn't just the victim of the lie. I had been part of what allowed it to exist, not knowingly, but consistently, by choosing comfort over confrontation, by choosing "it's probably nothing" over "this doesn't feel right," by waiting for something to be undeniable instead of trusting myself when it was still subtle. I stood up and walked to the spare room. The dress was hanging there, still zipped in its garment bag, untouched since the last fitting. For a moment, I just looked at it, not with sadness exactly, more like I was looking at an object that belonged to a different version of me. The woman who stood in front of mirrors, adjusting fabric, imagining a future that now felt wrong. I didn't unzip it. I didn't need to, because the dress wasn't the loss. The illusion attached to it was. By the afternoon, the outside world had started catching up. Not directly, not in official statements or dramatic confrontations, but in fragments. One person told me that Ethan had left the party early. Another said his father didn't shout. He just walked in, looked around, and asked one question before everything fell apart. Someone else mentioned that his ex had actually shown up. That detail didn't surprise me. It just confirmed how far things had already gone before I ever saw that group chat. But the most telling part wasn't what happened at the party. It was what happened after. People started disappearing. Not physically, socially. The same friends who had been loud in that chat went quiet. Messages slowed. Invitations stopped. The group energy that once revolved around Ethan shifted away from him almost overnight. Because chaos is fun when it's contained. It's not fun when it carries consequences. And Ethan, for the first time, was carrying consequences no one else could absorb for him. I didn't hear from Richard again. Not that day. Not the next. Not at all. And I understood why. Some things, once handled, don't need revisiting. He had made his decision. I had made mine. There was nothing left to discuss. As for Ethan, his messages didn't stop immediately. But they changed. Less anger, more confusion, then frustration again, then silence. Because eventually, even the most persistent attempts to rewrite reality start to fail when there's no one left willing to listen. That night, I sat alone in my apartment with no plans, no expectations, no version of the future trying to pull me forward. And for the first time since everything broke, I asked myself something honestly. Not about him, about me. Why didn't I see it sooner? The answer came quietly. I did. I just didn't want to believe it was enough. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that Ethan had been capable of this, but that somewhere, in smaller, quieter ways, he had already shown me who he was. And I had chosen to wait, to hope, to smooth over the discomfort until it either disappeared or became too big to ignore. Now it had, and there was no smoothing left to do. Just truth. The first version of the story I heard wasn't even from Ethan. It came from a mutual acquaintance. Not close enough to matter, but close enough to have heard something from someone who had been there that night. That's how stories like this spread. Not directly, never clean, always pass through layers of interpretation until the truth starts bending around people's comfort. He said it wasn't like that, she told me over the phone, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they don't want to offend either side. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't need to. And what does like that mean? I asked. She hesitated. That it was just a party. That things got exaggerated, that his dad overreacted. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. There it was. The first rewrite. Not denial. Just reduction. Take something sharp and make it dull enough to hold without cutting yourself. And the ex? I asked. Another pause. I don't know, she said quickly. People are saying different things. Of course they were. That's what happens when the truth becomes inconvenient. It fractures. Not because it's unclear, but because people don't want to carry it as it is. Okay, I said simply. You're not going to say anything? She asked. There was something almost surprised in her voice, as if silence from me felt unnatural, as if I was supposed to defend myself, clarify, justify. No, I said, there's nothing I need to add. Because there wasn't. The truth had already done its job. After that call, I noticed it more clearly. The way the story moved. Not toward clarity. Away from it. One version said Ethan had no idea his ex would be there. Another said he knew, but it was meant to be funny. Another insisted nothing had actually happened, so it shouldn't have mattered. Each version trimmed something uncomfortable. Each version protected a different piece of the same lie. And none of them addressed the only thing that actually mattered. That he had been willing. Willing to entertain it. Willing to let it happen. Willing to exist inside a version of our relationship where respect only applied when it was visible. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't chase the truth across conversations like it needed my help to survive. Because I had seen it. And once you see something clearly, other people's confusion doesn't make it less real. Over the next few days, the distance between me and that entire circle became natural. No dramatic cutoffs. No announcements. Just silence stretching wider until it turned into separation. The same people who used to fill group dinners, birthday messages, casual weekend plans, they faded. Not because I blocked them. Because they didn't know how to exist around me anymore. I was a reminder. Not of drama. Of consequence. A week later, I ran into someone from Ethan's side at a cafe. One of the quieter ones. The kind who watches more than he speaks. He looked surprised to see me, then uncomfortable, then resigned. Hey, he said. Hey. We stood there for a second, neither of us moving to leave. I didn't know you'd be here, he added. I didn't either, I replied. He nodded, then glanced down at his coffee like it might give him instructions on how to proceed. After a moment, he sighed. He messed up, he said. It was the first time anyone had said it that simply. No qualifiers. No edits. No attempt to reshape the narrative. I looked at him, really looked this time. You were in that chat, I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded once. I was. And you didn't say anything? Another pause. No, he admitted. I let that sit between us. Because that silence said more than any apology could. It wasn't supposed to go that far, he added quietly. There it was again. That phrase. Not supposed to. As if intention had some invisible boundary that no one could clearly define, but everyone conveniently recognized only after crossing it. But it did, I said. He nodded again, this time slower. Yeah. We stood there for another few seconds. Then he said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. He thought you'd never find out. Not cruel, not defensive, just factual. I felt something settle in my chest when he said that. Not new. Just confirmed. I know, I replied. He looked like he wanted to say more. Maybe apologize on behalf of a group that hadn't earned forgiveness. Maybe explain something that didn't actually need explaining. But instead, he just gave a small nod. I'm sorry, he said finally. I believed him. Not because it changed anything, but because it didn't try to. Take care, I said. You too. And then we walked in opposite directions. That conversation removed the last layer of noise. Because now, there were no more competing versions that mattered. It was exactly what it looked like. And Ethan had been exactly who he showed himself to be when he thought no one important was watching. 3 months later, my life doesn't look anything like it was supposed to. There's no wedding date circled on a calendar, no countdown, no final fittings, no version of me stepping into a future that had already been approved by everyone around me. All of that is gone. Not paused. Not delayed. Gone. And strangely, that absence feels cleaner than what I had before. People ask, sometimes carefully, sometimes out of curiosity they don't bother to hide. Do you ever regret how it ended? They don't ask what he did. They ask how I responded. Because that's easier to examine. Safer. I usually just give them a simple answer. No. And I leave it there. Because anything longer invites interpretation, and I'm no longer interested in helping people reshape something I already understand clearly. I heard a few more versions of the story after that. They never stopped completely. They just became quieter, more distant, less relevant. One person said Ethan had been blindsided. Another said he had been embarrassed more than anything else. Someone else insisted that if I had just handled it privately, things could have been worked through. That one almost made me laugh. Not because it was absurd, because it was familiar. That same logic had been sitting quietly underneath everything from the beginning. Fix it quietly. Hide it better. Keep the image intact. Don't let the truth interfere with something that looks good from the outside. But that was never going to be my role again. I didn't respond to any of those versions. I didn't correct them. I didn't defend myself. Because the truth doesn't become stronger when you argue for it. And it doesn't become weaker when people misunderstand it. It just stays exactly where it is. As for Ethan, I haven't seen him again. Not in person. Not by accident, not even in passing. At first, there were still messages. Not as many as before, not as intense, but enough to show he wasn't ready to accept the finality of what had happened. Then those stopped too, because eventually, when someone can't change your mind, can't shift your perspective, can't pull you back into a version of reality that benefits them, they run out of ways to reach you. And silence becomes the only thing left. I did hear, through someone else, that he tried to explain things to his father, tried to frame it differently, tried to soften what had been exposed. I don't know how that conversation went. I don't need to, because I already saw the moment that mattered. Not when he got caught, when he thought he wouldn't. That's the version of a person you build your life around. Not the one reacting to consequences. The one acting freely when they believe there are none. That's who he was. And that's who I almost married. I think about that sometimes. Not with anger. Not even with sadness anymore. More like awareness, a quiet understanding of how close I came to tying myself permanently to something that only worked as long as I didn't see it clearly. Because that's the part people don't talk about enough. It's not just about betrayal. It's about structure. What kind of foundation does a relationship actually have? Is it built on honesty? Or is it built on timing, image, and the assumption that certain truths will never surface? In my case, the answer became very simple. It only worked when it was hidden. And that means it never really worked at all. I still have the screenshots. I never deleted them. Not because I revisit them. I don't. But because they represent something important. Not the moment I lost him. The moment I saw clearly. There's a difference. One is about grief. The other is about truth. And truth, once it arrives like that, doesn't leave quietly. It rearranges everything. How you trust. How you listen. How you interpret the small things you used to ignore. It teaches you that clarity doesn't always come with warning. Sometimes it shows up all at once, in the middle of an ordinary evening, inside a message you were never supposed to see. And when it does, you get a choice. You can close the app, pretend you misunderstood, wait for a better explanation, or you can accept it, even if it destroys something you've spent years building. I chose to accept it, not because it was easy, because it was real. And here's the part I understand now, in a way I couldn't before. I didn't ruin anything. I didn't destroy a future. I didn't overreact. I didn't take something small and make it bigger than it was. I exposed something that couldn't survive being seen. That's all. And if something only holds together in the dark, then it was never strong to begin with. It just needed the right light.